left and right.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here. Seeing some of my old friends like Tuan there. I always know that he dreamed of being a civil servant in the tax department someday, and maybe that dream will come true. But that's not what I'm talking about today. I'm going to talk about how the welfare state is going to destroy Western economies, and may very well destroy economies in developing worlds, in the developing world, if they follow the advice of left-leaning international bureaucracies like the OECD and the IMF, et cetera, et cetera. Here are the key things that you need to understand. If you want to sort of go to sleep in 2 minutes and miss the rest of my presentation, that's fine, it won't bother me. Two things: we're living longer and we're having fewer children. Now, I have a lot of gray hair, not as much as Ken, but I have a lot of gray hair, and so I like the idea of us living longer. And, you know, it's our choice how many children we're going to have, but guess what happens when you mix increasing lifespans with fewer children? The long-run finances of most nations are going to become a disaster area. Why? Because we have tax and transfer welfare states that primarily take money from young people and give the money to old people. Well, what happens if that ratio of young people to old people begins to deteriorate? And again, it's not, I don't want to use deteriorate in a negative way, because again, it's good to live as long as possible, and it's also our choice how many kids to have. But when politicians have created entitlement programs, as we call them in the US, but just tax and transfer welfare states, they were all started when we had population pyramids. This is what it was called, where historically in societies, there were relatively few old people. There were lots and lots of workers, and then there was an even bigger generation of children coming up through the system. And so if governments decided, say 100 years ago, we're going to set up a welfare state and have the working age taxpayers support old people, it's not something that I would have liked as a libertarian if I was alive back in, say, 1930, back when Ken was just a young man. I wouldn't have liked it, but you know what? A modest welfare state was mathematically feasible. Not desirable, but it was feasible. And so long as your population had this pyramid shape, that welfare state, if it was modest size, could continue indefinitely. But there's a problem. The pyramid, the traditional population pyramid, has been changing. Here is an interactive graphic showing what's happening to the US population pyramid over time. You see, it used to be a triangle, and now it's becoming more of a cylinder, especially as we go out into the future. And this is the range of uncertainty, of course, when you're dealing with future estimates. But you can see from this thing that we are not going to have a population pyramid as we did back in the 1960s, 1970s. So that's what's happening in the United States. And what I want to do is show you lots of data, lots of charts, lots of images to drive this point home. I especially do this when I'm dealing with audiences. Obviously, this is a very sympathetic, friendly audience to the idea of less government, but when I'm dealing with politicians in Washington, or for that matter in Europe and elsewhere, it's very critical to try to just beat them over the head with a point over and over again, so they can't just accuse you or can't just privately suspect that you're just cherry-picking data. So let's look at a few other information sources here. Here's something from Our World in Data. Great website. It's not a libertarian website, but it's a great website if you're a data geek. You can find all sorts of information on historical incomes, lifespans, you name it. Well, this is looking at what the light gray is the 1950 population pyramid. This is for the entire world. The dark gray is the population pyramid a couple of years ago. And then look at what's the projection for 2100, the dashed line. Now, imagine that's just one country. And when you had this population pyramid, especially lots of workers, very few retirees, you could support those retirees with a modest payroll tax. Again, not what I would prefer. I prefer mandatory funded pension systems. Yes, that involves government coercion, but compared to unsustainable tax and transfer welfare states, I think it's a much better approach. So a modest-sized welfare state worked here. Worked here, not as well, but it worked. It doesn't work when you begin to get to that dashed line over time. Here's a chart, United Nations data. The blue line is the population 65 and over as a percent of the population, and the red line is the under 5 population. People under 5 years old are the future taxpayers. People over 65 are the beneficiaries. Now think about those two lines and the way they're crossing, and think about politicians 100 years ago creating welfare state programs that never envisioned this kind of look. Now obviously, we're right about here in 2021, so you can see the lines have just crossed. Imagine what's going to happen in coming decades. A lot of countries already have really onerous payroll taxes. That's usually the way they finance the old age redistribution programs. Imagine what's going to happen to those payroll taxes in the future, assuming politicians aren't willing to reform the programs. Here's another look at the data showing the total world population, including the estimate for 2050. You can see how what was definitely a population pyramid in 1950, somewhat of a population pyramid about a decade ago, well, it's becoming a cylinder. And again, whether we're looking at individual country data, whether we're looking at global data, we are seeing the same thing over and over again. Here's a different way of looking at the data. In order to have a stable population, you need to have, on average, 2.1 children born per woman. I don't know who the 0.1 is. Are you the 0.1? I don't know who the 0.1 is, but 2.1 on average. Well, look at some of these countries here. South Korea, 1.2, Portugal, 1.2, Moldova, 1.3, Spain, 1.3. A lot of European countries. I don't know if the Europeans have forgotten how to have fun and reproduce, but whatever is happening, they're having fewer future taxpayers. And of course, in Europe, that's where they have the biggest welfare states with the most generous payments. Now, what, you have like 3 children, don't you, Tuan? You are doing your part to keep big government going. Congratulations. You are, well, they're going to give you a gold star. So falling birth rates, you can see when you're looking at certain countries why the problem is especially acute. Here's another way of looking at it. It's looking at data for 2010 and 2050. The US is in green, but you can see a sampling of other countries, both developed countries and developing countries, and you can see the change in the number of dependents and the number of old people. You can see that that's dramatically changing. When these bars are jumping, like look at South Korea, it's gone from a 38 to an 88. What's going to happen to their tax burden? And by the way, when the politicians jack up the tax burden, because that's always their first instinct, what's going to happen to work effort and labor supply? What's going to happen to entrepreneurship? Those things are all going to go down when politicians make the mistake of putting the tax rates up. Here's fertility rates. We showed you a handful of countries that had really poor fertility rates. Again, I don't want to say poor, again, not in a negative way. I don't care how many children anybody has. But when we're talking about the future of the welfare state and the possibility of politicians adopting really bad policy, this should be sending out loud alarm bells to all of us. The US actually isn't too bad. I mean, we're right about that 2.1 that you need to keep your population stable. We, of course, have a lot of immigration, so our population goes up anyhow. But look what's happened in the European Union, and we can see specifically, I don't know why whoever put this chart together put Japan and Spain on there, but Japan and Spain are in a lot of trouble on this data. Here's another way of looking at the data. We have some major European countries and the United States and Japan, and you can see historically you had 4 workers per retiree, 4 workers, all of a sudden 3 workers, and look where you're going. In some of these countries, the green is Japan. In some of these countries, every single working age person is going to almost have to adopt an old person and be personally responsible for financing them. And again, when the benefits are relatively generous in a lot of these developed countries, you're talking about a major, major tax burden. Here's the age dependency ratio. 2015 is 2015. The white dots are 1975 and the black dots are 2050. And you can just see how the age dependency ratio is skyrocketing in a lot of countries. And by the way, when I'm talking to politicians and sharing these slides, I'm pointing out this is OECD data, this is UN data, so on and so forth. I'm not saying here are libertarian sources, because of course politicians would be very skeptical. But when it's their international bureaucracies that they like to fund sharing all this data, it becomes very hard for those politicians to be suspicious. Here's just another way of looking at what's happening to the 65 and over population. And you can see for the different continents what's happening. As Europe, of course, is in blue. That's where the problem's especially acute. And this is the age 20 to 64 population cohort. And you can see, like in Africa, it's still going up. But Europe in the blue line, it's going down. And other parts of the world, it's sort of cresting and beginning to fall, perhaps not as dramatically. And so, Tuan, you need to have like probably 4 or 5 more children at the very least. What does this actually mean for the population of some countries? If you're red, your population is falling between 2017 and 2050. And keep in mind, it's not just that your population is falling, your young population is falling while your elderly population is going up. Again, just different ways of looking at the same data, underscoring the fact that there's a major crisis that's going to happen. The Irish, my ancestors, they're still pretty good about populating, so they must like what couples sometimes do. Here's the old age dependency ratio, just another way of looking at it. The yellow circles are 2016, the red circles are 2070. I mean, dramatic changes. Doesn't matter how you slice the data, doesn't matter how you present the data, we're gonna have a major problem, and these are mostly OECD member countries. Here's one that I like. It came from a European Union report that was just released earlier this year. And it shows what's happening to the economic old age dependency ratio. In other words, how many old people are relying on how many working age people. And you can see for the Eurozone area and for the overall EU, it's going from basically the mid-40s by the time we get to 2045, which, by the way, really isn't that far away. I mean, Ken might even still be alive then. It's not that far. But look what it gets to the upper 60s. It actually, once you get to 2045, you don't get much worse when you get to 2070. But I want to make a separate point about this table of data right here. It's the ratio of old people to working age people. But working age people doesn't necessarily mean working people. And not only does it not mean working people, but when you're looking at actually working people, you have to look at who are the workers in the private sector, who are the net taxpayers, as opposed to the people like Tuan, who are clerks in the tax department. So if you actually compared private sector workers to the amount of old people, your ratio would look even worse, because those are the private sector workers are the only ones who are actually net contributors to the financing of this upside-down welfare state that we're now being affected by. Here's countries with declining populations, 2015 to 2100. I mean, it's all the same data. Everything's going up in the wrong direction in terms of the way the welfare state works. Not going in the wrong direction in terms of me living longer, going in the wrong direction in terms of all of the young people in the audience. You guys are really in trouble, because you are going to be pillaged by politicians to support people like me. Thank you very much, by the way. Here's China, since we hadn't focused on China. This is for the year 2048. It's not just that they don't have a population pyramid anymore. They actually do have a population pyramid, it's just almost upside down. I mean, some famous demographer, I forget who it was, said China will get old before China gets rich. Well, I think China was doomed not to get rich anyhow because they just don't have enough free market reform. They did a little bit in the 1980s, 1990s, but they've been stagnant ever since then, and I think Xi is now moving them backwards. But whatever China does, even if it did great policy, how are they going to get around this upside down pyramid? Because even though they actually understand this and they've relaxed their one-child policy, but guess what? The culture has changed. Every Chinese family now wants like one, they have the tiger moms wanting the one child and making them a super child. Well, they're not going to go back to having 3, 4, 5 children anymore. So China is in deep trouble because of this. Here's just more old age dependency ratio. But the reason I put this chart here, I mean, this just shows obviously more old people. Pension spending in 2014, that's the blue bar. The red bar is pension spending in 2050. And you can see how a lot of countries, you're more than doubling the burden of government spending simply on old age pensions. And in many countries, you spend less on old age pensions than you spend on old age health care. So if you imagine what would happen to this chart if you added in old age health care as well. And don't forget, as I keep saying, as the spending goes up to finance these greater number of old people, so are the taxes on the young people because there just aren't enough of them. Here's a handful of countries showing the old age dependency ratio. I'm getting very repetitive here, but again, this is what I do when I'm talking to hostile audiences, and I feel that they have to be buried with data so they can overcome the instinctive desire to say, oh, he's just a cranky libertarian, we don't have to listen to him. No, you have to listen because this data is clear. By the way, every single government actuary, long-term fiscal forecaster, they all know this data. I've been to some of the conferences where they sit there and they scratch their head and say, well, what would have to happen to taxes? And they make their forecasts and do their models. Everyone knows this, but politicians don't want to address it, or at least they don't want to address it until the crisis hits. No politician wants to take the political pain of saying, we're going to reform these programs now in order to save the country in the future, because that's some future politician's problem in their mind. As I said, you want to look at the taxpayer-dependent ratio. And what I'm concerned about, the message I keep trying to get across is, assuming there's not some magical burst of not only courage but good judgment, because politicians think it's courageous to raise taxes. Oh, look at us, we're gonna bravely get together and all agree to raise taxes together. Well, that's good for them. It's not good for their countries. It's not good for the people of their countries, but it's the easiest way for them to act bravely. What we need is not only bravery, we need good judgment. We need politicians who are willing to say, look at all this horrible long-run data. The programs that we started creating 50, 100, even 150 years ago, they just don't work anymore given the current trend lines in population. So we have to do something other than huge tax increases. We have to do something other than huge debt increases. What are those things? Well, what we basically need, oh, by the way, this is just why I'm so depressed and not overly confident about the results, because once you have a majority of the voting age population that lives off government, even if you had politicians who had good judgment and bravery, what makes us think they're going to get elected? I mean, I gave a speech in Greece a few years ago, and I pointed out that, at least according to the data, that none of the people disputed, so I assume the data was all right, something like 60% of the Greek population, voting age population, either had a government job, was getting a government pension, or was getting some sort of government redistribution program. When is Greece going to elect a Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan? Now, in theory, they should, because if you're a flea and the dog that you're on dies, that's not good for you. Parasites should want a healthy host. But if you're one of these interest groups in Greece or any other country that any of us live in, if you back away from the trough of government spending, is that going to solve the problem? No, you're going to think, well, just some other interest group is going to get a better spot and going to get more of the goodies. So the likelihood, as the populations change and more people become reliant on government, the likelihood that politicians will both have the good judgment and the courage and the public support to do the right thing, I worry those odds shrink. And so we have a Greek future for many nations. So here's obviously what needs to happen. I want to close up on this, and hopefully I haven't gone too long. We'll have time for some Q&A. What we really need is Singapore-style reform. Now, when I say Singapore-style reform, I don't mean getting caned for chewing gum or something like that. I know my friend Andy Cowan out there likes the idea of being caned, but most people, that's not the Singapore that we want to admire. What we want to admire about Singapore is the fact that they have mandatory private pre-funding for things, not only their pensions, but also their health care. It's not designed perfectly. I would much rather have it be designed in the way that the Australian and Chilean systems and others are designed. The government actually collects all the money in what's called the Central Provident Fund, which of course means that it can be invested in ways the government wants rather than private investment. But nonetheless, the fact that it is so big and broad, covering both pensions and health care, that to me is something that we should admire. Because consider what the alternatives are. If we don't have the courageous politicians with the good judgment and the political support to make good things happen, we're going to be looking at the higher taxes, and nowhere, anywhere in the world is the answer to any problem higher taxes, at least in my humble opinion. Tuan argues with me all the time, but no, I do not think higher taxes are ever a solution. And I don't think more debt will work. Because at some point, it differs in every single country, but in every single country, there comes a point where the international investors who buy government debt sort of say, well, hold on a second. Government debt is 130% of GDP. The economy's stagnant. The politicians are irresponsible. Do we really think if we buy country X's bonds that the politicians 10 years from now will pay us back? And obviously, in Greece, they hit that point about 10 years ago. They already would have hit that point in Italy if it wasn't for the European Central Bank buying up all the dodgy debt of different Eurozone countries. But the point is, and of course it's happened in Argentina lots of times. Anybody here from Argentina? I mean, I don't want to besmirch your fine, wonderful politicians. But of course, and it happens in lots of other countries. Of course, the IMF comes in and tries to bail out the stupid investors who actually buy government bonds from these countries, which is a whole separate problem. So as I said, we need the Singapore-style approach. But I want to close with a warning about the Singapore-style approach. You have major, what are called transition problems. And I'll give you an example from the United States, because obviously I'm most familiar with that data. The unfunded liabilities of our Social Security system, which is what we call our government pension system, if you look at the long-run deficit in the program over the next 75 years, adjust all those numbers for inflation, so we're doing apples-to-apples comparison, you are talking more than $40 trillion of unfunded liabilities. If you do it in present value terms, you get a different number. If you do it in nominal terms, you get a different number. But suffice to say, it's a huge, giant hole that we have in our budget where politicians have promised this much money and the revenue stream is only this much. Now, I keep telling American politicians we need to copy the countries around the world that have these pre-funded personal retirement accounts. And the smart politicians, or at least their staff, because very few of the politicians actually know any of this, but the smart staffers who work for the politicians will say, well, but Dan, your idea might be okay in theory, but do you realize if we allowed younger workers to take their payroll taxes and put those payroll taxes in personal retirement accounts, those are the payroll taxes that are now paying for current retirees. And those are the payroll taxes that we expect to use for the workers who are going to be retiring over the next 10 years. And what they're talking about is the transition challenge. In effect, the current generation is going to have to pay twice. You're going to have to pay to finance the transition. In other words, keep paying benefits to all the current retirees and older workers who wouldn't have time to benefit from the new system. You have to pay for them while at the same time putting away some of your own money for your pre-funded personal retirement account. That's no fun. Why do I have to pay twice just because Ken, back in the 1930s, didn't stop Roosevelt from creating the Social Security system? It's not fair, but you know what? There are estimates saying that financing the transition would be well above $10 trillion. And that's what I get from their staff who actually know the numbers. And my response to them is always the same. Yep, a $10 trillion transition cost to moving to personal retirement accounts, that's a huge chunk of money. But you know what? It's less than $42 trillion, which is basically the cost of the hole that exists in the current system. Now, if you're a politician, that should be a persuasive argument. Spend $10 trillion to get a stable, good system, or spend $40 trillion to prop up a financially unstable system. You would think they would choose the $10 trillion and go to personal retirement accounts, except for if they do the $10 trillion, they have to do that now, whereas Social Security system in the US doesn't blow up for another 10, 15, 20 years. So again, it's just that the elections politicians have a very short time horizon. It's the next election. They think 2 years or 4 years or 6 years down the road. So I'm very depressed at the likelihood that we're ever going to get the Singapore-style system. But I basically view my job as being Don Quixote. I tilt at windmills. I try to tell the most corrupt, venal people in the country, politicians, to do the right thing. I try to appeal to the better angels of their nature. The problem is they are all devils. I write about all this stuff, and pretty much every single chart that I showed you has shown up on my blog, danieljmitchell.wordpress.com, at some point or another. And I write a column every day about all these different types of issues. I just wrote about Social Security a couple of days ago. So with that, I'll shut up and see if anybody has any questions. Thank you.
Do you have any data?
Well, there's something in the academic literature called baumels disease. And baumels disease basically refers to the fact that over time, because of technology, the relative prices of different things change in society. So the relative price of producing things because of technology and manufacturing goes down over time, but the relative price of, say, providing elder care, which is basically just a time resource, labor resource to someone, that actually goes up in relative prices over time. So I've never studied that issue specifically, but as you're asking that question, and I'm thinking of Baumel's observations, I'm not sure that we're going to get some helpful breakthrough that's going to reduce the cost of supporting old people, especially, of course, with healthcare costs definitely rising much faster than average consumer price level. I think I agree with you, and I would simply note that we have groups that fill different niches in the United States, at least. Some focus on trying to educate the grassroots, some focus on trying to educate the clowns on Capitol Hill, some focus on the academic world, some focus on the business community. So the bottom line from my perspective is we need to go on offense everywhere. Now, maybe this is the time to give a little observation. We came incredibly close in the late 1990s when Bill Clinton was in the White House to getting personal retirement accounts. There were all sorts of groups in DC, serious think tanks, serious scholars, pushing this idea. This is when we had a nice period of fiscal restraint, and we actually had a budget surplus. And when you have a budget surplus, it makes it easier to sort of finance the transition costs, and the projections were looking pretty good. But unfortunately, something happened. That something was Monica Lewinsky. Monica Lewinsky got Bill Clinton in trouble, or maybe I should say Bill Clinton got Monica Lewinsky in trouble, but this was the famous White House intern that Bill Clinton was messing around with, and when that happened, and because of the subsequent legal implications and investigations of that, Bill Clinton got caught lying under oath. Republicans in Congress, who controlled Congress at the time, launched impeachment procedures, all interesting history, but one very important thing happened. Bill Clinton, who was being very supportive of the idea of personal retirement accounts, basically had to move hard left to shore up the Democrats so that they wouldn't vote for impeachment and they would be on his side. And there was actually one of Bill Clinton's, I think it was his chief of staff, but one of his senior people, basically, and when he wrote his sort of, My Time in Washington autobiography, he specifically said that the whole Monica Lewinsky impeachment thing ruined what would have been an agreement that would have been struck on Social Security reform. So I sometimes joke that what Monica did was the most expensive you-know-what in world history.
Okay, I'm going to let Mr. Dan pick who's going.
Okay, well, I guess I think well, how about these three right here? Because I know two of them fairly well and one of them a little bit. And actually, how much time do we have? Oh, and I know him too. You weren't even one of the three.
About 10 minutes.
Okay, so why don't we do 2 questions at a time, and that way we can get it faster. So that, and then him and him. Well, it's been attributed, I'll take these questions in reverse order. It's been attributed to de Tocqueville, it's been attributed to Benjamin Franklin. I have no idea who said it, but the person who said that, let me make sure I get it right. Democracy only works until people discover they can vote themselves other people's money. And now, our founding fathers in the United States designed a constitution that in theory fenced in the central government so that it had very few legitimate authorized powers. And with those very few limited authorized powers, it would have been impossible to have a big government. Well, they broke through that fence back in the 1930s. And so now we basically have untrammeled majoritarianism. So yes, I am very worried that democracies basically vote themselves out of existence with irresponsibility. Regarding your point, John, I mean, you're familiar with baumels disease, right? And you know some of that literature, I'm sure. I don't know the answer. When I deal with the really smart folks on the left and I debate them, they say, oh, Dan, you're just being too pessimistic because even if we only have 2% growth, 2% compounded over 75 years, we're going to be much richer in the future and we're going to be able to afford doing all these things. But I sort of worry that you described it as an arms race between technology and I guess cost. Well, I view it as an arms race between the growth of government and the economic growth rate. And I think that the growth of government is going to begin to push down that economic growth rate. And I have very little reason to think, for instance, in Europe, where some of the countries have gone further down the wrong path, I just have very little reason to think that the technology is going to help. I desperately want to be wrong, though. I would love to be wrong, and I would love it if you were wildly successful. Now, do it when I'm still young enough to enjoy life. But other than that, I hope for great success. The 2 questions over here. Well, I'll take those again in reverse order. By the way, one thing I didn't put up on my options, I mentioned we could have big tax increases, we could have big debt increases, or we could have Singapore-style reform. We could also just print money, sort of the Argentina-Zimbabwe approach to everything, and that might be a possibility. What you referred to was Hauser's law. Hauser is a US economist who noted that over time, taxes never get above 20% of GDP on the central government level in the United States. I want Hauser's law to be true. I want it to be true. But I think what Hauser's law really points out is that an income tax basically has a hard time collecting more than about 20% of GDP. Why? Because when you increase taxes on the rich have a lot of ability to simply change their behavioral patterns and not pay the higher taxes. The only way you can have big, bloated European-style government is with heavy taxes on the poor and the middle class. Now, will that happen in the United States? Mark my words, the giant fight that will determine the future of the United States, the politicians in Washington are salivating for a value-added tax. If they get a value-added tax, it's game over. I'm going to move to Australia, or Estonia, someplace, because we will have no hope then of constraining the growth of government. And by the way, it's not just that Europe has a value-added tax and the United States don't. They also have income taxes that are at much higher rates, at much lower levels of income. They have higher energy taxes, which again screw over the middle class and lower income people in Europe. So Europe basically has figured out how to pillage the middle class and lower income taxpayers. They don't actually tax the rich higher than we do in America. The difference, if you look at the data, it's very, very clear. They get the lower income and middle class people. That's the fight that's going to determine the trajectory in the United States. Now, regarding your question, Jeff, I was just down in Chile a couple of years ago. This was before they actually had the street protests, which then led to this call for a new constitution. They are now drafting a new constitution in Chile. The one they have now is halfway decent. The new one will create all sorts of entitlements. For those of you who are into philosophy, you probably know there's this concept of negative liberty versus positive liberty. Positive liberty is the liberty to live off somebody else. Negative liberty is the liberty to be left alone by government. So obviously libertarians like negative liberty, even though it's a negative word, the meaning is good. Chile has a fairly good constitution that somewhat limits the growth of government and the role of government. If this new constitution goes into effect, which will require another plebiscite, by the way, then will they immediately get rid of the private pension system? I do wonder about that. When I talked to Jose Piñera when I was down there, he was the guy who designed the new system. I mean, Jose said that it's very easy for the left to demagogue against it, but at the end of the day, the average Chilean has a real nest egg of their own money sitting in their pension fund. And when politicians actually in a very real way say, we're going to take that away from you, there is some hope that we'll be able to stop it. But there's no question, right now the left is in the ascendancy in Chile, and Chile is one of the most successful models in the world in terms of private pension systems. So if that fails, I'll be, well, heck, I'm depressed all the time anyhow about public policy, but I'll be even more depressed because it is such a good case study. If we have more questions or not?
No, we just want to thank you especially because we know you made a special effort to be here today. So just any final thoughts from you to the audience? Or?
Well, first, I want to apologize. I have to fly back on the red eye to the United States tonight because, not because I'm doing something important on public policy, but I'm playing in a softball tournament for people 60 and over. So, I'm trying to stay healthy until you fix everything so I can live forever. But I do appreciate everything that Liberty International does. I've been at maybe 5 of these conferences. You're doing a great job taking over from others, and God, you've been doing it forever. I hope this continues strong and we somehow can save not just the Western world, but the entire world from statism. So thank you.
Dr. Dan.